Hello, and welcome to the recording for the lecture on Chapter 6, which is Immune System and Leukocyte Function. This is part 1. Share the screen as always, and take several seconds to get set up. Okay. So we will begin by saying this is an enormous chapter. I spent an enormous amount of time organizing and reorganizing and simplifying and reorganizing this information. So the lecture, I try to make it clear where I'm taking the information from in the chapter, but some of it is not in the same sequence that the chapter of our textbook follows. This, I promise, will make more sense than the way the authors organized things. Because of the material that we're going to skip, it just makes sense to put it together this way. And I'll show you an overview, and we'll keep going back to that overview. So this first half, part 1, is going to be, let's call it a high altitude overview of the immune system, meaning that we're going to look at it in very little detail initially, and then in part 2, we'll go through those same areas of the immune system, but we'll look at it in more detail. Our authors refer to 3 levels of protection. You may have heard this described as 3 lines of defense. They mean the same thing. Basically, it means this. There's a first line of defense, or a first level of protection, and those are the physical barriers. We're talking about the skin and the mucous membranes. Those are epithelial tissues. The cells are right up against each other. They form a pretty good barrier. If those barriers get breached, which happens, then we get to the second line of defense. In some sources, you'll see this described as the inflammatory response, or just inflammation. And then finally, the third line of defense, which most people use the term immunity or adaptive immunity for that. And that is very specific to particular infections, like a particular species or a particular strain of a virus. And then there are some umbrella terms. This first one, innate immunity. Innate means inborn or born with it. Our authors limit this term, innate immunity, and they use it to mean the inflammatory response. In other sources, you'll see innate immunity also including the barriers. It makes sense in the sense of, like, you're born with your skin and your mucous membranes. But like I said, our textbook refers to innate immunity. Specifically, it's the inflammatory response. And then this third line is adaptive immunity. Okay, now in going over the information, this is what makes sense to me to organize it this way. We're going to look at innate immunity, and we'll see that there are certain cells involved, very specific for inflammation. Those cells release some inflammatory chemicals that cause other cells to respond a certain way. And there are some protein systems that are already in the blood. They're already in place in the blood. So I'll refer to these as the plasma proteins. Specifically, for our purposes, we're going to talk about the complement system. Okay, so that's all under inflammation. Then under adaptive immunity, we'll also see that there are cells involved, and pretty much it's the cells that we're interested in. These are the lymphocytes. You'll hear them broken into 2 main categories, the B cells and the T cells. The B cells are the ones that mature. When they're stimulated to mature, they can produce antibodies. And we'll talk about what those are and what they're used for and how we can use them. All right, so the first topic that we're going to cover are the cells of both innate immunity and adaptive immunity. Where do they come from? As I mentioned before, you're going to see this diagram repeatedly throughout this first half and the second half, and I'll always put a little red box showing you where we are, and hopefully we won't get too lost. All right, so we're going to be talking about the cells. First, we'll talk about the cells of innate immunity, and then we'll talk about adaptive immunity. And the first slide I'm going to show you is just stuff you already learned about blood. All right, so what you first learned about blood cells probably was that we have red blood cells, the erythrocytes, and just focus on what's in the red boxes for now. And you learned about some white blood cells, and you probably learned them in this order, in the order of how common they are. Those are neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. If you ever got this mnemonic, never let monkeys eat bananas, as a way of remembering which ones are the most common. That's helpful for remembering the names. However, there's something a little bit funny. You can see this asterisk here. Lymphocytes are way over here, because lymphocytes, they are white blood cells, but they come from a slightly different source. In passing, I'm just going to mention platelets. Here they are, just because you probably learned about them, as you know, these are the cellular or partially cellular material that's in blood. All right, we're going to go into a little bit more detail to understand what's going on with our immune systems. We're actually going to look at the two main lines of descent in blood cell formation. The technical term for that is hematopoiesis, hematoblood, and poiesis is the formation of. We have two main lines. So we start with these multipotent stem cell in the bone marrow. It can become any kind of cell of blood, but it will differentiate either into a myeloid line or a lymphoid line cells, and then everything descends from those. So we have the myeloid line, and most of the cells of inflammation, that innate defense, those mostly come from this myeloid line. It's, you know, the 4 of the 5 white blood cells that you know and love, the basophils, neutrophils, eosinophils, and monocytes. And then there are going to be some cells that are stationed in the tissues. You've probably heard of these before, the mast cells, macrophages, and dendritic cells. Now, I said that most of them came from the myeloid line because, oh, wait, I'm sorry. There is a little bit of terminology I need to introduce, because our authors of our textbook use a term. It's fairly old-fashioned, but they use it a lot, and I don't want you to be confused by it. So going back to these white blood cells, the basophils, neutrophils, eosinophils, and monocytes, notice that 3 of the names end in "phil," which means love. And why they're called that has to do with how these cells got named before anybody knew what they did. The deal is, when you look at these cells under a microscope, you can identify them based on, say, the shape of the nucleus. But another key feature is that they have what look like polka dots in them, or granules, which is what they used to be called, or still called. Those little bubbles that are inside of them are known as granules. And so scientists who were first studying these would stain them with different stains. Some is an acidic stain, a basic stain, and they would see which one would stain better. And so basophil, these were the ones that were stained with the more basic stains. It takes the basic stain really well, so base loving. And then there's the eosinophils, that's the acid loving ones. And then neutrophils have granules that stain with both kinds of stains. And so neutral because it has some basic and some acidic granules. Okay, that's not hugely important for what we want to do, but I told you that whole story so that you could remember that granules have to do with staining, and this fill name, it refers to which kind of stain those granules would take up. Okay, so these three cells are known as the granulocytes. And so again, here I underlined the fill, put an asterisk next to it: neutrophil, eosinophils, and basophils. Again, I don't think it's an especially helpful term, but you'll see it. So these are the granulocytes, and the monocytes and lymphocytes are the agranulocytes. There you have it. All right, so moving on. I said that we had cells in circulation. Those are those white blood cells in circulation, but then there's some cells that we find out in the tissues. One kind of cell out in the tissues is the mast cells, and you don't have a counterpart in the bloodstream that's measurable, but now we know that mast cells originate from this myeloid stem cell line. Okay, so they come from the bone marrow, but then they go out into the tissues and they station themselves in the tissues. Cells that are stationed in the tissues are sometimes referred to as sentinel cells. Those are, cops, just on their beat, cruising around, and these cells can move around. It's really kind of cool. Okay, so I mentioned the mast cells. Then we get to macrophages, which means big eaters. And macrophages are descended from the monocytes. So in circulation, you'll find monocytes, but once they come out into the tissues, they'll mature and become macrophages. There's another set of cells in the tissues, these sentinel cells, and those are called dendritic cells. And they look a little bit different, but some of them also come from monocytes. Those of you who are very observant will see that there's another arrow, and I'll get back to that arrow shortly. But as I've mentioned numerous times, the majority of the cells of inflammation come from this myeloid line. Now here's where that other arrow comes in. Some of the cells of inflammation do come from the lymphoid line. This is relatively new information. You've probably heard of NK cells or natural killer cells. These are cells, they're a kind of lymphocyte. Why they're now being classified as part of the innate immunity is because they behave kind of like innate immunity cells, meaning that they respond to cells and tissues as a group. They're not specific for a particular species or a particular antigen. There are some innate lymphoid cells of various kinds. We're not going to get into that detail. And some of the dendritic cells, as we saw the other arrow, some of the dendritic cells come from this lymphoid line. But mostly it's myeloid cells that give rise to the innate immune cells. Now let's take a closer look at the adaptive immune cells. Ta-da, you knew this. All of the cells of adaptive immunity come from the lymphoid line. And in general, we call it the lymphocytes, and we call them T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. There's another reason for it, but a way to remember it is that T cells are the ones that mature in the thymus gland. The thymus gland is the gland that sits in the chest. It's not the thyroid gland that's here in the throat. It's the thymus gland down here in the thorax. And then the B cells are the ones that mature in the bone marrow. So T cells and B cells. And as we'll see later, there are multiple kinds of T cells. All right, so here's a summary of all of those different kinds of cells. On the top part of the slide, we have the cells of innate immunity or inflammation. Most of them come from the myeloid line. There's the granulocytes, as we've mentioned, these are the three fills. The agranulocytes, which is the monocytes, that when they go out into the tissues, become macrophages and dendritic cells. And then we have the cells that mostly we just see out in the tissues, and those are the mast cells. And the mast cells are really the ones that kind of get this ball rolling, the inflammatory response started. And then there's a few lymphoid cells, namely the natural killer cells. And why they're classified here is because they're acting like generalists, like the other cells. Then down below, we have the cells of adaptive immunity. These are all lymphoid cells, the B cells and the T cells. And the T cells, as we'll see, they're further subdivided into various classes. Some of this information you can find on these pages. All right, so now we're going to do a general overview of innate immunity. This is pretty high altitude overview. We're talking about inflammation, and I'll remind you most of the cells from the myeloid line. What it's for, why do we get inflamed? The function is to destroy infectious or injurious organisms, bacteria, fungi, and anything that's getting in, we want it out. It walls off the site of infection. Now, here's an important point. The innate immune response and the adaptive immune response, initially when they were first described, we thought they were two separate things. It turns out they interact all the time. And so part of the job of innate immunity is to stimulate the adaptive immune response. As we'll see, macrophages and dendritic cells, they both can take in, say, a bacterium, chop it up, and then present what they have seen. They present that to the helper T cells. Which is great. The inflammatory response also stimulates tissue healing. So it kind of gets us started on, get rid of the infection, but then how that infection got in, there's probably some holes somewhere and we need to fix that up. And then some of the characteristics of this inflammatory response. We already talked about how the cells are all from the bone marrow. So the cells have to get to the tissues through blood vessels. And so this occurs best in well-vascularized tissues. And what I mean is that there are some tissues that don't have a great blood supply, some of the connective tissues specifically. So some connective tissues have great blood supply, like the dermis of the skin, fantastic blood supply. It heals very well. But say some of the dense connective tissues, like ligaments, they're kind of famous for not healing well. They don't have a good vasculature because all the collagen fibers that are in there would be interrupted if you had blood vessels kind of running through there. And so, yeah, so those are some of the tissues that have the hardest time healing. Cartilage also has blood supply around it, but not going through it. Keep going. Immediate response. The cells are in place. The cells are already in the tissues. The proteins are already in the bloodstream. So you get responses fast within hours, and certainly within 24 hours, you already have a good response going. This is a non-specific response, meaning it's not specific to a particular species of bacterium, for example. Like a neutrophil is going to go after a bacterium no matter what species it is. There's no memory involved here. That means that the first infection and the 100th infection with the same microbe looks the same. There's no like, oh, I know what to do now. that we'll see somewhere else in the immune system. Unfortunately, the inflammatory response is going to affect any tissues that are in the area. And so although we do need an inflammatory response to start addressing infection or injury, an uncontrolled inflammatory response will do some damage. And so this has to be self-limiting. It has to cut itself off, or else we end up with a disease. All right, the components, as we've mentioned, there are cells involved. There are some inflammatory chemicals, and we'll go into those in more detail in part 2. But let me just mention off the top of my head, histamine is one of the most important ones to kind of get the ball rolling, the inflammatory ball rolling. And then we have leukotrienes and prostaglandins that also serve a function. And there are more, but those are the ones that I'll mention. And then the plasma protein systems, I've already mentioned one, and it's the one that we're going to talk about, and that is the complement system. The other two, if you've learned this before, there's well, the clotting system. Obviously, the clotting system is involved in blood clotting, but it also plays a role here because we need fibrin. Remember, I mentioned the walling off of an area. That comes in part from depositing some fibrin out in the tissues, and the kinin system. But mostly we're going to talk about complement. Let's do the general overview of adaptive immunity. Again, we're doing this from quite a distance, so not a lot of detail. This is an important point. Sometimes you will see adaptive immunity referred to as acquired immunity, meaning not innate. It's something that you get or you work on as you're exposed to new pathogens or new toxins or something that's causing a problem for the body. All right, so once again, here we are in, I've lost my mouse, there it is, adaptive immunity, third line, and the cells are from the lymphoid line. All right, so what's this for? The primary function is to prevent, or if an infection gets established, to eradicate an infection. What's less well known is that the adaptive immune response is also involved in the surveillance for and destruction of cancer cells. And you may be thinking, well, it must not work because people get cancer. And that's true, but there's many more cancer cells that start than that end up being detected as cancers, because cells start misbehaving well before there's a detectable tumor. A tumor is just a pile of cells, of a cell that's kind of gone rogue and has made copies and copies and copies of itself. And so there is time before there's a detectable tumor for our adaptive immune system to identify this misbehaving cell and get rid of it. There are, of course, mutations that occur in the cancer cells that kind of elude the activity of our lymphocytes, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. The adaptive immune response is responsible for organ rejection. So over the years, people have figured out how to transplant organs from one donor to a recipient who needs, say, a kidney. The thing is, though, we know that there are certain things you have to match. You have to make sure that the donor is the same blood type as your recipient, that there are these other major histocompatibility proteins on the surfaces that need to match in a number of ways. But even then, there is a response to this tissue. So the immune system can start mounting an attack against these tissues, which is why when somebody receives a donated organ from another human, they are typically put on immunosuppressant medications for the rest of their lives. There is the disadvantage of that patient being more susceptible to infection, but there is that's being done in the interest of preserving the tissue graft and preserving the transplant. And as with all of the systems, there are problems that arise with this system. Some of the things that can happen is the adaptive immune response can damage our healthy cells and actually stimulate a pathologic inflammatory response. What we refer to as allergies or allergic responses or hypersensitivity reactions, that's coming from the adaptive immune response. It's a total overreaction. For example, some people are sensitive to peanuts. Peanuts are pretty innocuous. However, for whatever reason, some people's immune system reacts to peanuts as if we are absolutely under attack and must do everything we can to get rid of that antigen. And yeah, it's not good for the patient, but so this is where that reaction is coming from, the adaptive immune system. And then finally, the adaptive immune system can misfire and start attacking its own tissues, causing an autoimmune disease. And we'll mention these briefly at the end of part 2. All right, we'll wrap up part 1 with a comparison of innate immunity with adaptive immunity. And I'm going to take adaptive immunity and move it down here. And so on the next slide where I do the comparison, we'll do the characteristics of innate immunity in the top left and characteristics of adaptive immunity in the bottom right. And we'll do this comparison. All right, so up on the left, we've got the innate or inflammatory response. This is rapid. Within hours, there's detectable changes. It's non-specific. It doesn't have to be a tailored response to a particular species of bacterium. It's just a general response to bacterial infection. There's no memory. As I mentioned before, the 100th infection is just like the first infection. I'm going to go after it the same way. Nothing's going to be different. It involves certain cells, as we mentioned, and the plasma protein systems. Then we have the adaptive immune response. This one we think of as occurring much slower. Now, things do start happening immediately, but there's no measurable change in the first few days, in fact. So that's what we mean by slower. The rapid responses within hours, there's detectable effects, there's swelling, there's redness. With the adaptive immune response, we're not going to see ramping up of antibody amounts until days later. This adaptive immune response is quite specific. You get a response to a particular species and, in fact, a particular part of a particular organism. There is memory, meaning that the second time you get exposed to something, the response is going to be faster and stronger than it was the first time you were exposed to something. And it's this very memory that we exploit. We have figured out how to use that to our benefit. And that's what vaccines are all about, is exposing our immune system, our adaptive immune system, to something that it can recognize. And so hopefully we can avoid the initial exposure in illness and just go straight to the second exposure response that keeps the infection at bay. This one is the one that involves the lymphocytes and the antibodies. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, it can be induced by vaccination. And that is a wrap up of the part 1 high altitude overview. And we'll do part 2 in more detail. See you there.